Welcome to Decoding Leadership, where we break down the elements of humane and effective leadership. I'm your host, Jade Rubik. In today's episode, I talk with Jayanthan Bhattatharipad, and he is somebody that I worked with previously at a role a year or two ago. And he was somebody that I just really enjoyed working with. We had a lot of interesting discussions about leadership and management and just being a human being. And I'm really excited to introduce you to him. Jay has had a really interesting background. He started out in consulting at ThoughtWorks. He's been a software engineer. He's been a director of engineering. He's been VP of engineering, gone back to being a software engineer. He's really held a lot of different roles in his career. I met him a couple of years ago at Revolution Parts, where I hired him to be part of a very experienced engineering leadership team. He most recently is at Cisco and has left that job as a director of engineering. Really excited to introduce you to Jay. Welcome to the show, Jay. I think we're going to do something unusual this time, which is to start with a slideshow. When we worked together, you did this very interesting slideshow introducing yourself to your team. And I thought it was so impressive and so interesting that I thought maybe you could show us what you do with these slideshows as a way of introducing yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Jade. Thanks for the opportunity. I was thinking about this earlier today, and it's really ironic that I'm using presentations because I've always thought that I hated doing presentations. But as I think about it, maybe I don't hate it so much. Maybe it does serve a purpose, and I kind of enjoy it. But my career, and about myself, I live in the Bay Area. My career has been two halves, if you will. The first half was mostly consulting. And a lot of these slides, I think, came from needing to do these presentations. Agile became a thing and people are asking about it. I had to present it. And so I just kept growing these slides. And then it moved to organization culture, which is something which fascinates me a lot. So there were areas around that, systems thinking. But back to my career, two halves, I did consulting at ThoughtWorks, where I learned a lot about Agile. It was truly remarkable experience. I continued that at another consulting firm called Tacit. And then in about 2014, I joined Expedia as a program manager and got nudged into a people management role with really no experience. And so then I had to start again, learn about engineering management. So I had slides around those, right? And so it's been awesome. And I'd be really happy to share some of them. Right now, I'm looking for another opportunity. So that's where I'm at. Every team is on a trajectory, right? And so when I join an organization, I find that there are many opportunities in the course of that journey where I can bring in certain things that are pertinent to that team at that particular point. A lot of it is around Agile, as I was saying. But I usually always include a slide around mental health and safety. I feel that organizations are missing a trick in the sense that if our goal is to maximize stakeholder value, we should be really doing everything that helps with that. And I think having an environment that is based on trust really helps us deliver outsized value. And I find that having a team that is happy, that works well together, has significant productivity gains over teams that don't. And I think and personally too, I think it's really important to me that I'm happy, like as I'm sure it is for most people. So I include this slide and some variants of this. But this is an example, and then I have a bunch of these, but this is an example of a slide that I have. And I don't really talk about Scrum or XP here, but I think if you read between the lines, I think the point that I'm trying to make over here is that I think Scrum is, it's a really good first step, but it is only that first step. And I think invariably I find teams that use Scrum as a goal, but it really isn't. And the reason is this, which is I've seen teams succeed without using story points. They don't estimate, they have no ceremonies or variable sprint lengths, but they still succeed, right? Which sort of means that the more important things are the things that lie below, which is sort of why I align myself more with XP, and I find a lot more value with XP. So unit testing, test automation, and all of the other engineering principles. And I've added one, which is clear user stories, which I think is going to be more and more important. And I don't think organizations pay as much attention to getting their requirements buttoned down as well as they should. And I think that XP is really hard, but I think it's really the right way to build software. This slide, it sort of came up first at Expedia, where we had to change things around in the sense that at that time, I was leading the mobile team, and we were delivering features, or we were releasing to the App Store pretty much based on when features were ready. Right. And we had manual regression that took more than a week. So don't get signed off for a week once we say it's ready. And then there's a lot of back and forth manual testing, which really wasn't sustainable in the long run. And so we had what is our North Star, right? And so almost any team that I join, once I get a sense of where we could improve, I have this slide to say, okay, this is what we want to work towards, right? And some of them we may be able to measure, some of them not, but invariably test first development, pair programming, trunk based development, small stories, right? Continuous delivery. And the last two, the programmable acceptance criteria and clear value, are two things that I've pushed in a little later, which one thing that I find a pattern, and it could be because of the companies that I've worked for, but I find a pattern where there isn't really enough discipline when it comes to acceptance criteria. And I'm like BDD, for example, is Cucumber. I've seen it used sporadically, but I do feel that in this world of agentic engineers running around doing stuff, it's even more important that we be very clear about what it is we're asking our engineers to build, right? And therefore, acceptance criteria, and then clear value, which is another peeve that I have, which is many times I see software factories, people are just building feature after feature without really expecting any value, without measuring value, without being clear about ROI, and it's just like one feature after the other, right? So and that's the context of those two. Where can we be very clear about the value that each story is bringing, and can we be clear about what it is that we want to be built? And I think both of those, there are gaps that I see in the industry. And the part over here, I think many of these is really a question of balancing our short-term goals with our long-term goals, right? And I think what we will find is that in the long run, if we are able to, if we have good automation, a good suite of suites, where engineers write programs in pairs, where there isn't asynchronous code reviews, trunk-based development, in the long run, this team is going to move faster than one that doesn't do this. And it's ironic because I distinctly remember in New York, one of the founders of Scrum, I forget which, explicitly stating that Scrum is going to give customers a 10x productivity boost, which I'm very skeptical of. But I do believe that if we were using XP, whether we unit tests, it's not even a question anymore. I do believe that we'll be able to move faster and deliver more value. So that's really this defining what that North Star is for that particular thing. And then a few more examples. I really like this quote by James Clear. Goals are for people who care about winning once. Systems are for people who care about winning repeatedly. And this notion of systems thinking, it's really important for us in the team, for all of us to be thinking about, where, okay, should we fix this? Should this be a band-aid, or should we fix this permanently? How can we make sure that this doesn't happen again? Right? How can we reduce the feedback loop? Right? So all of these questions, I think, and the more people in the team think about it systemically, I think the less we will react. And so this is another a slide that I bring where I find that people tend to react. They don't have a proper root cause analysis and that sort of thing. So this is really around systems thinking. Another one around expectations, and this is where when we have teams that have very little or not as much structure, it's always better to start and say, okay, let's have a baseline, right? And so 2-week iterations, I don't really care whether we have iterations or not, but it's really good to have some structure. So having a stand-up, whether I really like stand-ups. I think it's a heartbeat of the team. But there are people who prefer to do that offline, right? And initial stages of any team, I expect it's a good opportunity for me to learn more about the team. So things like stand-ups, I think it's sort of non-negotiable at the beginning, right? And then in terms of work ethic, right, picking up work consistently, make sure it's done consistently, show some love for the agile wall, right? It has a equal distribution of stories, bugs, tech, retro items. Stories, again, having detail. Ensure that the planning meeting or the estimation meeting isn't the first time that people have. Those are all symptoms of it being a software fact. Just some thoughts and then some other lofty goals, finding time to share ideas, finding time to ask questions. Our goal is to have a team that's solving problems together, right, without throwing things over the wall. And then it's my favorite topic, performance management. And it's also the one that gives me the most heartbreak. But I try to bring this up so that people think about performance less about the individual, more about what it is that the team does, right? And so this quote from Deming, I value a lot. And this is tied to the systems thinking, because if the system accounts for 90 to 94% of the performance of a system, then we really should be focusing on the system and the interaction of people and smoothing communication and all of that without really worrying about performance management. Right? And so when I talk to people about performance, the three questions: do you do your job well? Do you do it on time? And are you a person that other people would like to work with, right? These are the questions that I think people should be having in the back of their mind. Are you doing your best? Are you getting better every day? Are you learning? Are you being a better leader? How do you become a better leader? Becoming a better person, right? Similarly, do you complete your work on time? So here there's the estimation part, there's a commitment part, there's the asking for help part, right? And most importantly, no surprises. And are you a person who others like to work with, right? And so if you do your work on time and you do really good work, people may be willing to put up with you being not the kindest person in on the team. But the point being, like, this is really, really important, right? The dynamics of the team really makes a huge impact on what value we're delivering. So are you a person others like to work with? It's a very interesting problem, because when we take a person of one, right, say I'm managing just myself, right, I know how hard that is, right? I know how hard it is to change habits, to become a kinder person, to become more patient, right? Now add another person to that, right? Me and my fiance as a couple, right? I know how hard it is to manage a couple, and then it exponentially gets harder and harder as we think about a team, right? And so this aspect of kindness and nonviolent communication, I think all of that helps creating a thriving team. And I think more often than not, we don't have the patience to fix these things, right? It's just, okay, this person isn't kind, that's okay, because this person, but then there's a long-term effect to all of that, and that's the point here. I use this slide to break this notion that people have that you can always look up the chain for answers, right? I want to break that notion, and mostly because I don't want a culture where people think that because I have a title, what I'm saying is true, because I can be as wrong as anyone else. And invariably, like, I have to, if I'm being smart about this, I have to expect that I'm wrong half the time, right? And the only way that I can get better is if I have an environment where people know that I could be wrong, and that I want to know when I'm wrong, right? And so that is the part here which is really, really hard, because most often we don't take the time to really talk through ideas to see whether it makes sense or not. We just take it for granted, and we just accept what the highest paid person in the room asks for or says. And so now I think groups make better decisions, but I think it's harder to make group decisions. And then, sort of related to that, one of the things that I'm fairly sure about is every person that I've interacted with has a superpower, which I wish I had. Right? It could be listening, or it could be a thoughtfulness. Okay, it doesn't matter what it is, right? So, and then if you take that up a notch. And if you think about a team, there's always some characteristic that a team has that makes you be proud to be part of it, right? And I think this is just a reminder to teams that regardless of what is happening out there, there is something unique about this team that I'm really proud to be part of. And it doesn't matter which team that I've been part of. Like every team that I've worked for, I've genuinely felt this way. That's just a high level. I have a whole bunch of other slides, Jade, that we can talk about. So, for example, I'm quite fascinated that people talk about productivity without thinking about waste, right? One of the things that I've learned, especially when we think about Agile with its lean underpinnings, right? And you think about waste, at the end of the day, the only thing that's of value is code in production, at least in our industry, right? So then if there are a lot of things we have to be mindful of, which is wasteful, and we have to do what it takes to prevent that waste, right? Like partially done work, extra processes, extra features, right? Extra features is a killer for me because I find in conversations that people are always, hey, let me ask for this extra feature today in case I don't get it in the future, right? That's just a common theme that I see. Whereas we'd rather be building teams that are able to react quickly, right? Able to embrace change, right? And not worry about trying to get more done today than we really need, because that's waste, right? Then waiting, task switching. And this task switching, it's an absolute killer because it's invariable that engineers have the are the source of truth in terms of how product behaves, right? And so invariably engineers are called upon for non-engineering work, right? And they need to switch in a context switch. We don't measure it, we don't think about it, but if we add all these things, and I think just fixing some of this is it goes a long way in improving productivity, which without needing to worry about lines of code, for example. And once you have a process in place, it's almost impossible to get rid of, or like recurring meetings, for example. They will stay on the calendar forever, right? And I wonder if it's because we aren't really paying as much attention to our customers as we say we are, or we don't really think about it in the form of a value stream, right? Like how many hops is this idea going to take before it, gets into the hands of a customer?
I wonder if a good comparison is buying things and getting rid of things. It's so much easier to buy something than it is to deal with it when you don't want it. So you end up accumulating so much stuff. In this abundant life that we lead, we end up having so much clutter in our lives. And I wonder if there's something analogous to that in our work lives where it's easier to add things to a to-do list than it is to remove it. And it's easy to just have too many things. That's just where all the incentives are.
Yeah, and I think if when the resource becomes time, right, I think it's very hard to get a handle of where that goes. Like if when you think about like manufacturing a car, for example, it's fairly clear in terms of what the components are and how they fit in and how they go and where time is spent for each of the activities, right? But in software development, we still have zero handle on where we think time should go for each of those activities. We have no idea. I think part of it has to do with it's immature as an industry, but I think it's also the activities are so intensive in terms of like interaction intensive, right? That there's just bound to be waste because people are just spending time interacting.
It also occurs to me that a lot of the practices require a body of knowledge or a set of experiences before they even really make sense. Like something like XP or lean approaches don't by default seem like the way you should do things. It's something you have to be indoctrinated into, or you have to see the pain or experiment your way into it. it's not just something that naturally occurs to people. It's almost like something you have to be trained for. Do you agree with that?
I wonder if some of it has to do with free money. So, two aspects. One is people don't stay in organizations long enough to necessarily experience the impact of many of their decisions, right? So, if you look at something like XP, you need to be there long enough to try it out. And the only way you can most likely learn it is if somebody who can teach you, right? Because it's non-trivial, right? And so once it becomes so hard, then you're like, well, that's just a very high bar. Why bother? And you can always add, like, you have plenty of money, so you can add routines that are non-productive, and nobody really is questioning the outcomes anyway because it can't be measured.
I find that so interesting because to me, it's actually a little bit hopeful. It's a hopeful thought because my general sense has been that when you're in an area of our industry that's growing rapidly, there's a lot of opportunity and generally there's space for culture or there's space for humanity. And people's skill sets are more in demand. And so there's more need for them and there's more need to treat people well and for sustainable work cultures. But I guess what I like about what you're saying is that there's also a way that people can learn environments that are not going through crazy hypergrowth and where the result of their actions is something that they can actually like learn from.
Yeah. I think the odds are stacked against the industry just because of a lot of the environment factors. Like, and things have just happened really, really fast. And I think about this like engineering management as a discipline, right? Even with a lot of material that is a lot of blogs and books, and if you look at like Will Larson managing humans, there's a lot of good content, but it's still very nascent if you look at it, right? Like if you look at the body of work in terms of software engineering management, there isn't really much there in terms of a framework or in terms of processes. Or I get people are pretty much still iterating over this.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Mostly the way people learn from these things is copying the environment that they're in. So it's mostly this cargo culting. And then the second way we do it is we copy from these case studies like the Spotify model and some version in our head of what we think that actually is. I've seen so many examples of that, not just with Spotify.
Yeah.
It would be hilarious if the results just weren't so terrible.
Yeah, I think to an extent, I think managers also, like, nobody has patience, right, with any of this.
One of the things you talked about in your presentation was about XP, and you contrasted it with Scrum. Can you tell me a little about how you see that spectrum and why you contrast those two particular things?
I find that the way that Scrum, like if you want to understand the impact of Scrum versus XP, like it's really interesting to know how does something like Scrum get adopted in an organization versus XP. When ThoughtWorks, for example, when over there, the project was pretty much engineering driven, and it was the engineers who were adamant about pair programming or writing tests first, trunk based. They were the ones because they knew they had the autonomy, but they also knew that in the long run, this is the best way to build software while retaining your sanity. But if you look at how Scrum is introduced, invariably, and this is my guess, Scrum will be somebody going up to a manager and saying, hey, the way to increase your productivity is by adopting Scrum. Do you want to triple your velocity in 4 months? Adopt Scrum, right? And that adoption, I think, is very superficial because you get some benefits of doing something iteratively, but not really end to end, right? I mean, it doesn't, as far as the 2 week, the sprint length is very arbitrary, right? Doesn't really matter, which is what my earlier point is. Like, there's a lot more value in focusing on building the TDD skills or pair programming skills than it is to worry overly about whether your sprint length is 2 or not. And I we first half of my career was pretty much XP. The second half, not so much. I distinctly remember thinking, after I moved from an XP team to a Scrum team or whatever, distinctly remember thinking, I have not needed to worry about bugs as much ever before in my life. Like, bugs were the word triage was new to me, as was to a certain extent regression, because there weren't that many for it to be a thing, right? And so when I think about it, like, I really don't know how teams, to operate without unit tests. But I mean, if you're able to write your tests first, and if you're able to push to trunk, and that finds its way to production, I mean, from a customer value perspective, is there anything better than that? I don't think so. So why wouldn't we do that, right? Because it's really, really hard. And so that's why you need the practitioners who really care about it and who are willing to put in the work to learn to be able to do that. So it's a bit unfortunate, but that's how things are, I think.
I do think sometimes XP is pretty well named, like extreme programming, because there is something about it where people find it daunting to adopt. There's a lot of practices that are a part of it, like pair programming is a perfect example. Seems like a very good idea, but it requires a change in behavior, and it's actually something a lot of teams struggle to adopt. It requires some real work to change the way you work and communicate together. And so you have to actually try it out and adopt it. And it's not just like you can start next week completely doing XP. And it's interesting because you can with Scrum. You do it like this little training, and then all of a sudden you can just roll it out. It's very nicely packaged and simple to roll out.
Yeah, I remember engineers who would push back on writing unit tests. Right? They were like, "This is a waste of time. Right? Why do we need to maintain double the lines of code than what we do now?" And so I think all of these are like, sort of like, pair programming is another one where I remember my mentor at ThoughtWorks. He would say, if you have 8 engineers, 4 machines. That's the way he solved the pair programming. You'd only have a piece of hardware for 2 of you, so you had to pair. But I do think it's really hard, and I think just having 80+% unit test coverage itself is, it's great. But I do think there's a difference, and I think it's nice to have that goal, right? I do think XP is more effective. I think Scrum is a little lazy when it comes to improving software teams. This is, I think, the hardest thing, which is putting the organization first, and then the team, and then the self, right? I think a lot of teams fail because of selfish behaviors, right? And I really find that to be a valuable thought. Like, whenever you're making a decision, it's just, is this good for the team, right? Or is this good for the company? And then I have a whole bunch of slides on Agile, which, as I said, is where I started building these. And so this one, I just want to make one comment of this Agile. So before I joined ThoughtWorks, I worked for a company where we spent about 7 or 8 months, like a team of 50 people, I think, documenting an existing system so that it can be rewritten. And I remember 7 or 8 months of this work, the customer pulled the plug, and I think they'd spent $4 or $5 million. And I distinctly remember what we delivered was a bunch of Word documents. And it was while this was happening that Martin Fowler comes to Bangalore and gives a presentation on Agile. And I'm like, this makes so much sense, right? And at the end of the day, right, it's working software. That's the only thing that counts. And I still remember that story because just the way that that project was structured really determined what value we were delivering, and just fascinating. Right. And then aspects about project management, like why it's hard, why software building software is not, it's not easy. The agile, manifesto, something about people building relationships is important, listening, etc. And it just goes on and just on and on. I'm not really a big fan of estimation, but it is useful because it helps more about what you want to build. Mythical Man Month, I'm sure a lot of these you.
So, how do you use these follow-up slides after you've introduced yourself? Do you use them to answer follow-up questions or team discussions or what?
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, it could be different settings, right? So I think even when you look at, you mentioned the intro slide, over the course of time, you know, say all hands or a staff meeting, or you have like a TPM guild, right? You, you sort of detect certain patterns, and certain things come to your mind. Say, well, we need to address this problem as a team, right? Or whatever that team may be. It could be like all of mobile, or it could be just the TPMs or just the engineering managers. And then I bring these in just for that particular context, right? If that makes sense. So the intro is like a one-off, but then there's always an opportunity to to change, right? And that's what this is. It's really just planting a seed so that the team can change.
So, do you view this as the first step of like, I know the teams can improve as a team, but there's also sometimes like an element of coaching or training the team. So, like, how do you balance these various ways of engaging with the team to improve and to improve the team's ability to deliver value?
So I think this, when we think about important versus urgent, right? I think we do need some anchor that keeps track of the important things that we need to measure. So there's one aspect which is the team isn't thinking this is important, but I know that this is important. And I know that in 3 months, we need to have made progress. And so that's one thing where, I use this as a way of sharing that this is important, right? And in most cases, I would have had these conversations on the side before the presentation itself, right? So it's not like it's the first time people are seeing necessarily, right? It depends. But then after that, it will sort of come back into the staff meeting as a story to be tracked, because I do want to see progress, right? With whatever it may be, right? And
But
then, oh yeah, and I was just like, if you think about, say, for example, there's a new program and you need to plan, right? And you have like 3 Scrum teams and you want to come up with a high level program plan. It could be the team, they don't have the experience doing it, but that's an opportunity for me to work to pair with somebody. And we talk about pairing only in the context of writing code, but I find that I do better if I can pair on anything, right? Even if it's 2 managers working together crafting an email, right? So I view that as an opportunity to work with somebody and then, spend half a day, come up with a plan, or writing better user stories, right? Having a story kickoff where you have a TPM, a QA, the engineer, you work together, understand the story, improve the acceptance criteria. Like those are all activities that you want to introduce to implement some of the ideas that you bring up.
so this has been super fun. I love the presentation format. I think what I love about it is that it's showing the team who you are in a personal way. And it comes across as just very authentic. And so it's not just introducing the team to your expectations or something like that. It's also introducing them to your values and who you are. That's what really struck me when I saw the presentation for the first time. I just thought it was such a personal way of introducing yourself and a very effective way of helping the team understand who you are and also show them a future of like how the team is going to improve together and how you were going to partner with them to make their world better. I just love it. Just very good leadership work and super fun to see.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the hardest parts in a leadership role is ego, right? And it's unfortunate because ego doesn't help us get better, right? And so when I think about, like, at the end of the day, we're all trying to get better, right? I mean, organizations are trying to get better, individuals are trying to get better, right? And I just find that, and when I observe myself, like, yes, it does sound great when a subordinate treats you with more respect than you think you deserve. Unfortunately, my genetic makeup is such that, hey, something, there is a trigger and I have to observe it and I have to say, hey. So I think the hardest part is battling that, right? Because it's very easy for us to say that we need to put the team first, and then you counter that with something selfish, right? It's a huge challenge. That like trying to seek that perfection where you are the best possible version of a human being, right? So that you can uplift a team. I think it's super challenging. Super challenging.
Yeah. It's funny because there's these different traditions of leadership. There's the egoless leader, the kind of servant leader type, and it's presented as one model, and it's a part of our leadership tradition. And there's this other model, which is very aggressive, the like assertive, like I'm always right leader. And I guess I just find it really interesting how these two archetypes can really coexist even within the same person.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. And that is, I think, one of the struggles that I've had in my career, which is what is that right balance of assertiveness, right? It's super challenging. Yeah. How can I voice my opinion without being a dick?
In my family, we have a family friend that is just uniquely talented at basically telling people anything in a way that they can really hear it. My mother actually said that she's somebody that could tell you to freak off and you would thank her for it. And what I took from that is that there is a way to say everything in a way people can receive. It's just figuring out what that is. And sometimes that's really hard. It's so hidden.
And people don't really understand the uphill battle that people from other cultures face,
Hmm.
right? Like, I literally didn't know how to react to somebody complimenting me till about 5 years back.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
Well, in my culture, like, people don't thank you. Like, I mean, I'm not saying people don't show gratitude, but there's no explicit, you don't use the word please, you don't say thank. You rarely say good morning. And I'm being very specific about the community I'm from, right? I think it applies to a certain extent to India, but generally it is. So when somebody says thank you, it took me a long time to be able to be smooth about replying, you're welcome, without really worrying too much whether I mean it or I don't mean it, or what is the like, it's very natural. Thank you, you're welcome. So things like that. Just communication is so hard when you're from another culture.
The example of that that really bent my mind and totally surprised me was I lived in Japan for a while. And weirdly, while I was in Japan, most of my friends were Korean. And I learned that in Korean culture, the closer you are to somebody, the less you say thank you or please. If you're truly close with somebody, you would never say please or thank you, because the closer you are, the less those sort of things are necessary, the more you should take things like that for granted. And so it's almost insulting because it's putting distance between you and the other person if you're adding all this formality.
Yeah, you're creating a formality in the relationship that you didn't think existed.
When I first heard that, I was like, oh my God, all my assumptions about how people communicate are wrong.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Huh. Well, Jay, I think we're at time today. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Like many of our conversations we've had in the past, I think this has just been super interesting. And I'm really glad that we get to share this conversation with our audience. So thank you so much for your time and hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Decoding Leadership. As always, I welcome your questions and feedback. And if you're looking for coaching or advisory help, you can contact me at Rubik.com. See you next time.